The wind that evening carried a soft chill, brushing against the quiet river that ran beneath the old steel bridge. The sky had already faded into shades of gray, and the streetlights flickered along the empty road. The place was peaceful in a lonely kind of way. Edward Hale walked slowly across the bridge, his hands tucked inside the pockets of his brown coat. He was an old man now, but his back was still straight, and there was something about his walk that spoke of confidence built over a lifetime. He had made his fortune in real estate years ago, turning small-town land into gold. People respected him for his success, but also whispered that he could be cold when it came to business. Edward didn't mind. He had learned long ago that success and friendship rarely stayed in the same room. He stopped in the middle of the bridge and looked down at the dark water. The reflection of the streetlights rippled in the current, broken every now and then by the wind. He checked his watch, a gold pocket watch, a gift from his late wife. It was nearly 7. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, growing brighter as a car approached. The sound of tires slowed and a man stepped out. It was Mark Jensen. He looked to be in his 40s, tall but tired-looking, with deep lines around his eyes. His jacket was wrinkled, and his shoes carried dust from long days on the road. Edward turned toward him with a polite nod. "You're right on time." Mark gave a faint smile, though his eyes didn't match it. "I didn't want to keep you waiting." The two men stood there for a moment, the river whispering below. The only sound was the distant cry of a train somewhere beyond the hills. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Edward said softly. "It's been years." Mark stepped closer, hands buried in his coat pockets. "You could say I didn't have much of a choice." Edward studied him carefully. "You said it was about the land deal. The one in Brookfield?" Mark's jaw tightened. "That's right. The same deal that ruined me." Edward sighed quietly. "You know as well as I do, Mark, that it was a risk you chose to take. No one forced your hand." Mark's voice grew tense. "You promised me it was safe. You said the return would be good. I trusted you, Edward." "And I trusted you to read the contract," Edward replied, his tone calm but firm. "You were an investor, not a child. We all lost something in that downturn." Mark laughed under his breath, but it wasn't a happy laugh. "You didn't lose anything. You still live in that big house on the hill. You still have everything. I lost my job, my savings, my marriage." Edward turned his gaze back to the river, letting the silence stretch between them. "I'm sorry for what you lost, Mark, truly. But you can't spend the rest of your life blaming me." Mark took a slow step forward. "It's easy for you to say that. You've never had to start over from nothing." "I started from nothing," Edward said, his voice growing firm. "You know my story. I worked for every dollar I earned. You think I was handed my success? You think it was luck?" Mark clenched his fists in his pockets. His eyes flicked to the side, catching the faint glow of the water below. "Maybe it wasn't luck," he muttered, "but you've had enough of it for both of us." Neither man noticed the small figure crouched under the bridge. Tommy Lewis, an 8-year-old boy, sat hidden near one of the metal beams, his knees drawn up to his chest. He often came to the river after school when things got loud at home. His parents argued a lot these days, and the bridge felt like a place where he could breathe. He liked the sound of the water and the quiet that came with it. Tonight, though, he wasn't alone. He had heard the car earlier and peeked up to see 2 men talking. They didn't look like friends. The older one seemed calm, but the other's voice carried something sharp in it. Tommy couldn't hear every word, but he could feel the tension. Above him, Mark took another step toward Edward. "You could have helped me," he said, his voice low. "After the deal went bad, you could have done something. A loan, a job, anything." Edward shook his head slowly. "I gave you advice, Mark. I told you to stay patient, to rebuild. You wanted an easy way out." Mark's anger flickered. "You have more money than you could ever spend, and you couldn't spare a little to help someone who trusted you." "This isn't about money," Edward replied. "It's about responsibility. I can't carry the weight of every man who made a bad choice." Mark's expression darkened. He took a deep breath, the kind that comes before words one can't take back. "You always talk about responsibility," he said, "but you never take any yourself. You build your fortune on people like me, people who believed in you." Edward's eyes softened a little. "I never wanted to see you fall, Mark. You're angry, and I understand that. But don't let it turn you into someone you're not." For a brief moment, Mark's shoulders lowered. His breathing slowed, and it seemed like the storm inside him might fade. But then Edward spoke again gently, and it was that softness that broke something inside Mark. "If you ever want to start again," Edward said, "come by my office. I can help you find work, or I don't need your pity," Mark snapped. His voice echoed over the water, startling a bird from the trees nearby. The sound faded into the night, leaving only silence behind. Under the bridge, Tommy flinched. He wanted to run, but his curiosity kept him still. Edward looked tired now. "Then what do you want, Mark?" he asked quietly. "Why are you really here?" Mark's face tightened. "I wanted you to feel what it's like to lose something. To know what it's like when someone takes everything from you." Edward shook his head. "You're not making sense. I didn't take anything from you." But Mark wasn't listening anymore. He took a step closer, his voice trembling with emotion. "You took my life, Edward. You took my future." Edward raised a hand slightly, trying to calm him. "You need to go home. We'll talk when you've cleared your head." Mark's eyes flicked to the side, to the long drop below the bridge. The dark water moved slowly, carrying the reflection of the streetlight in thin silver lines. "I can't go home," he said quietly. "There's nothing left for me there." Edward's heart sank at the sound of those words. He saw the pain behind them, the kind that goes beyond anger. For a brief moment he felt sorry. Not for himself, but for the man standing in front of him. "You're better than this," he said softly. "You can still make things right." Mark's eyes glistened, though not from tears. "You think words can fix what's broken?" Edward opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, Mark stepped back and rubbed his face. His breath came fast and uneven. "Forget it," he said finally, his voice shaking. "You wouldn't understand." He turned away and began walking toward his car, his shoes echoing across the bridge. Edward watched him go, sadness in his eyes. But halfway to the car, Mark stopped. His shoulders tensed and he turned back, his expression unreadable in the dim light. For a long moment he just stood there, staring at the man by the railing. Then he walked slowly back toward him. Edward looked up as Mark approached again. "What now?" he asked. Mark hesitated. "I just want to know one thing," he said. "Do you ever feel guilty? About anything you've done?" Edward didn't answer right away. He took a deep breath and said, "I feel guilty for trusting people who let anger control them." Mark's jaw tightened. The air between them grew heavy again, thick with all the words neither man had said over the years. Finally, Edward stepped back from the railing. "Let's end this here. I'll call you tomorrow. We can talk properly." Mark said nothing. He just stared, his mind racing with thoughts too loud to ignore. Then, with a suddenness that even he didn't expect, he turned and walked away again. Edward exhaled, unaware that the night's silence had not yet finished with him. Down below, Tommy still crouched, heart pounding in his chest. He had heard every word now, or enough to know that something bad had almost happened. He pressed his back against the cold steel and stared at the rippling water. When he finally dared to look up again, both men were still there. One standing by the railing, the other walking back toward his car. The boy didn't understand everything they said, but he felt the tension like a shadow over the water. A gust of wind blew across the bridge, carrying with it the faint sound of the river's current, and the heavy silence of two lives crossing at the wrong moment in time. Edward checked his watch once more, then slipped it back into his pocket. The light glinted faintly off the gold surface, a soft reminder of better days. He looked out over the river and took a deep breath, unaware that from below, small eyes still watched him through the steel beams. The night carried on. The river kept moving and the bridge stood quiet, holding secrets that would soon come to light. The sound of the river grew louder as the night deepened. The air carried a quiet stillness. But something uneasy lingered over the bridge. A feeling that what had begun as a conversation was about to turn into something far heavier. Edward stayed near the railing, staring out into the darkness. The water below looked calm, but the reflection of the lights danced restlessly on the surface. He rubbed his hands together to keep them warm and took another deep breath. His thoughts wandered. He couldn't help but think about how strange life was. How people you once worked with, laughed with, could someday look at you like a stranger. Behind him, Mark stood still by his car. He had opened the driver's door, but he couldn't bring himself to get in. His mind spun like a storm. He felt the sting of old memories, losing his business, the arguments with his wife before she left, the long nights when he couldn't sleep because the bills kept piling up. Each memory came like a wave, washing over whatever calm he had left. He looked back at Edward, still standing on the bridge like a shadow against the lights. For a moment, Mark wondered if he had made a mistake coming here. He had wanted to talk to get things off his chest, but now it all felt useless. Words didn't change anything. He took a few slow steps back toward the bridge, his shoes echoing against the metal surface. Edward turned slightly, hearing him approach. "I thought you were leaving," Edward said quietly. "I was," Mark replied. His voice sounded tired. "But I can't." Edward studied him for a long second. "Then what do you want from me, Mark?" "I've told you the truth. I can't undo the past." Mark shook his head, his face tight. "You keep saying that like it means something, but it doesn't. You don't understand what it's like to lose everything because of someone else's decision." Edward's voice softened. "I do understand. You're not the only one who's lost something in life." Mark's eyes flashed with frustration. "You say that, but you still have everything. You have your house, your name, your comfort. People look at you like you're some kind of saint. But you've built that image on people like me." Edward turned fully to face him. The wind lifted the edge of his coat. "You've let bitterness eat away at you," he said. "That's not my doing. That's yours." Mark took another step forward. The distance between them grew smaller. "You think you're better than me?" Edward sighed. "No, I think you've lost your way. I'm trying to tell you that revenge won't fix what's broken." Mark laughed under his breath. "Revenge," he said softly, almost to himself. "That's not what I came for." "Then what?" Edward asked. Mark didn't answer right away. He looked past the old man toward the river, watching the dark current move below. "You know what it's like to drown, Edward?" he asked quietly. Edward frowned. "No, and neither do you." Mark nodded slowly. "I do, every day. I wake up and it feels like I'm still under the water, struggling to breathe while everyone else just watches." Edward hesitated. For a moment he saw not an angry man but a broken one. "You can still come up for air," he said softly. "It's not too late." Mark stared at him, his jaw tight, his eyes full of something unsteady, not hate but exhaustion. "It is too late." Under the bridge, Tommy was still hidden between the beams. His legs had gone numb, but he didn't dare move. He could hear the men talking, their voices carried by the wind. He couldn't see their faces clearly anymore, but he could feel that the conversation had changed. It wasn't just anger now. It was something deeper, sadder, and scarier. He wanted to go home, but something in him said to stay. He couldn't explain it. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe fear, or maybe the strange feeling that something important was happening, something he shouldn't look away from. Above him, Mark walked closer until he was only a few feet away from Edward. "Do you remember that night?" Mark said suddenly. "The one at your office after the deal went bad? You told me to be patient, that things would turn around." Edward nodded slowly. "Yes, I remember." "You told me to sell the property before it was too late," Mark continued. "I did. You bought it. And a year later it doubled in value." Edward frowned. "That was business, Mark. The market changed." Mark shook his head, a bitter smile forming. "You knew it would." "You always knew. You took what I had and called it fair." Edward's face grew pale. "That's not true. You lied to me," Mark said, his voice rising. "You said you wanted to help me. You said we were partners." Edward opened his mouth to speak, but Mark cut him off. "You took advantage of me and you don't even see it." "I didn't take anything from you," Edward said firmly. "You made your choices. I can't be responsible for them." Mark's hands shook slightly. "You've told yourself that so many times you actually believe it." The silence that followed felt heavy. The river below seemed to move slower, as if it were listening. Edward took a slow breath. "Mark, I'm sorry. Not for the deal, but for the way it hurt you. If I could have done things differently, maybe I would have. But you can't let anger define you. You have to let go." Mark looked down at his shoes, his face hidden in shadow. "Let go," he repeated quietly. "That's what everyone says." He glanced up again, his eyes hardening. "But what if I can't?" Edward took a small step closer. "Then it'll destroy you." Mark's voice dropped. "Maybe that's the only way to feel something again." The air grew colder. Even Tommy, from below, could feel the shift. He hugged his knees tighter and held his breath. Edward sensed the danger now, not from Mark's words, but from the look in his eyes. It was the kind of look that came from too much pain and too little hope. "Mark," Edward said carefully, "listen to me. You don't have to do anything you'll regret." Mark looked at him for a long moment. His hands came out of his pockets, trembling slightly. "You're right," he said softly. "But it's too late for both of us." Edward's heart began to pound. "What are you talking about?" Mark took another step forward. The space between them vanished. Edward instinctively raised a hand as if to stop him. But Mark grabbed his coat instead. The two men stood frozen for a second, the old man trying to steady himself, the younger one caught between guilt and rage. "Mark," Edward said quietly, his voice calm but shaking. "Don't." Mark blinked, his expression confused. Torn between what he wanted to do and what he feared he might do, his grip loosened slightly, then tightened again. "I just wanted you to say you were sorry," Mark whispered. "I am," Edward said, his voice barely above a breath. "I am sorry." For a moment everything went still. The river, the wind, even the lights seemed to dim. Then Mark let go and stepped back. Edward stumbled, catching the railing with one hand. He looked up at Mark with a strange mix of fear and sadness. "You don't want to do this," he said. Mark turned away, running a hand through his hair. "You think I want any of this? You think I wanted my life to turn out like this?" Edward shook his head. "Then stop, go home." "Start again," Mark laughed bitterly. "Home? There's no home to go to." The sound of a car horn echoed in the distance, faint but enough to break the moment. Mark looked down at his hands, then at the water below. His voice dropped to a whisper. "I never wanted to hurt anyone," he said, "but it feels like no one ever hears me unless I do." Edward reached out slowly. "I hear you," he said. "You're not alone." Mark looked up at him, and for a heartbeat his face softened. He looked like the man he once was before everything went wrong. "I wish I could believe that," he said. He stepped back from the railing, breathing hard. The tension seemed to lift slightly as he turned toward his car again. For a moment Edward thought it was over, that maybe words had finally reached through. But as Mark reached his car, he froze. His reflection in the window looked back at him, tired eyes, empty expression. Something inside him broke again, quick and silent. He turned around. Edward was standing with his hand on the railing, watching him cautiously. Mark took a deep breath and walked back toward him. "He'll never understand," he said softly. Edward looked weary now. "Maybe not. But I'd like to try." Mark's voice cracked. "You had everything, and I have nothing left." Edward's eyes filled with sorrow. "That's not true." The wind picked up again, carrying the faint creak of the bridge. From below, Tommy's heart thudded in his chest. He didn't know what was happening anymore, but every sound, every breath from above felt louder than the world. Edward reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the gold watch. He opened it, glancing at the time. "It's late," he said gently. "Let's both go home." The faint light from the watch flickered in the dark. For a moment, Mark stared at it. That small shining thing, a symbol of everything he thought he'd lost. His hands shook again. He turned his face away, and the wind carried only the sound of the river. Endless, moving, quiet. Down below, Tommy stared upward, his breath shallow. The night felt heavy now, as if it were holding its breath too, waiting for what would come next. And above, on that lonely bridge, two men stood, one burdened by guilt, the other by loss, unaware that a small boy beneath them was watching, eyes wide, frozen in silence. The night was colder now. The wind moved over the river like a soft whisper, carrying with it the distant hum of cars from the highway. The bridge stood quiet again, as if nothing had happened there, but the air still felt heavy with everything left unsaid. Tommy stayed hidden below, his small body pressed against the metal beam. He had been there so long that his legs hurt, but he didn't dare move. He could still see the faint glow of the streetlight above and the two shadows cast across the bridge. He didn't understand every word the men had said, but he knew something wasn't right. There was anger up there, sadness too, the kind that made his stomach twist. He wanted to go home. He wanted to be back in his room, where his mother's soft radio played and the smell of dinner filled the air. But part of him couldn't leave. He had seen too much to walk away now, though he didn't know why he felt that way. Up above, Mark leaned against the railing, staring into the dark water. Edward stood a few steps away, watching him carefully. Neither of them spoke for a while. The silence was thick, the kind that holds two people together even when they can't find the right words. Edward finally broke it. "You should go home, Mark," he said softly. "There's nothing left to say tonight." Mark didn't answer. He was lost in his own thoughts, looking down at the river as if it were the only thing that understood him. Edward sighed. He was tired, not just from the cold or the hour, but from the weight of all the years that had led to this. "You're not a bad man," he said gently. "You're just hurt." "I know that feeling." Mark turned his head slightly, his eyes dull and distant. "Do you?" he asked. "Do you really know what that feels like?" Edward nodded. "Yes, you lose people. You lose time. You lose yourself in the noise of it all, but you have to find your way back." Mark gave a faint, bitter laugh. "You make it sound easy." "It's not," Edward said. "But it's worth it." For a long moment neither spoke. The river moved below them, steady and endless, as if it had seen all this before. Then Mark sighed, his voice quiet. "I used to look up to you, you know. When we worked together, you had this way of walking into a room and making everyone believe things would be fine. You were everything I wanted to be." Edward looked down at his hands. "I wish that had meant more to you." Mark smiled weakly. "It did. Until it didn't." He looked out again, his eyes reflecting the dim light. "I tried to be like you. I worked hard. I followed every rule. But no matter what I did, I kept falling behind. You always seemed untouchable." Edward's voice softened. "It wasn't as easy as it looked." Mark shook his head. "Maybe. But people like me don't get second chances." Edward frowned. "That's not true." "You're still breathing, aren't you?" Mark let out a tired breath, his shoulders slumping. "Barely." Down below, Tommy was still listening, though his eyelids were heavy. The man's voice sounded strange now. Not angry anymore, just sad. The kind of sad that made you want to say something, even if you didn't know what. Tommy thought about his father for a moment. About the nights when his dad would sit on the porch, staring at nothing, a beer can in his hand. He remembered the quiet, the same kind of quiet that hung in the air now. Maybe grown-ups just carried sadness differently, he thought. Maybe it lived inside them, heavy and hidden. Up above, Mark spoke again, his voice lower. "Do you ever think about what happens after all this?" Edward blinked. "What do you mean?" Mark looked down at the river. "When it's all over. When the money doesn't matter anymore, and there's no one left to impress. What's left?" Edward hesitated. "Peace, I hope," he said. "If we're lucky." Mark smiled faintly. "Peace, that's a nice word." Edward looked at him, trying to read what was behind those words. "Mark, you're scaring me a little," he said. Mark shook his head. "I don't mean to." Edward took a step closer, his voice steady. "Then don't do anything foolish. You can walk away tonight, start again. There's always a way back." Mark's eyes stayed fixed on the water. "You still believe that?" "I have to," Edward said. "Otherwise, what's the point?" Mark turned to him. For a moment, his expression softened, like a man caught between two choices. "You know, you talk like someone who's made peace with everything," he said. Edward gave a small smile. "Maybe I've just learned what matters." Mark looked down. "I wish I had." The wind blew again, lifting the ends of their coats. The sound of water moving below filled the silence between them. Then Mark spoke again, almost to himself. "I didn't come here to hurt anyone. I came because I thought if I could just look you in the eye, maybe I'd understand why everything went wrong." Edward nodded. "And now that you have?" Mark gave a sad smile. "I still don't know." For a while the two stood there side by side, looking down at the river. The anger that had brought them together seemed to fade into something quieter. Regret, maybe, or just exhaustion. Then Edward reached into his pocket again and took out the gold watch. He turned it in his hand, the light catching the metal. "My wife gave me this on our 25th anniversary," he said softly. "She said it was a reminder that time doesn't stop for anyone." Mark looked at the watch, his eyes drawn to it. "It's beautiful," he said. Edward smiled faintly. "She had good taste." Mark stared a little longer, the reflection of the light flickering in his eyes. Then he looked away, ashamed of the thoughts running through his mind. "I should go," he said quietly. "Before I say something I'll regret." Edward nodded. "That's a good idea." Mark turned to walk toward his car. Edward watched him, hoping it was really over this time. But halfway across the bridge, Mark stopped again. He looked back one last time, and his face carried something Edward couldn't read. Sorrow, confusion, and something like fear. "You ever wish you could just start over?" Mark asked softly. Edward nodded. Every day. Mark gave a small, almost broken laugh. Me too. He turned and kept walking. The sound of his footsteps grew softer until it disappeared completely. The only sound left was the wind and the steady hum of the river. Edward stayed there a little longer, his thoughts drifting like the water below. He felt both relief and sadness. He knew the man was hurting, and he wished he could have done more. But sometimes, he thought, people carried storms you couldn't calm for them. Finally, he turned and began walking toward the other end of the bridge. His hands were deep in his pockets and his breath showed in small clouds against the cold air. Under the bridge, Tommy finally shifted, stretching his cramped legs. He could barely feel his toes anymore. He decided it was time to go home. He started crawling slowly toward the end of the beam, careful not to make noise. But just as he reached the edge, he heard the sound of footsteps again, fast, uneven. Coming back toward the bridge, he froze. It was Mark. Tommy's heart began to race. He couldn't see what was happening, but he could tell by the sound of those steps that something had changed. They were quicker now, heavier. Edward turned, surprised to see Mark running back toward him. "Mark," he said, startled. "What are you doing?" Mark stopped a few steps away, breathing hard. His voice shook when he spoke. "I'm sorry," he said. I can't let this end like that." Edward frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," Mark said, shaking his head. I don't know anymore." Edward stepped forward carefully. "Then take a deep breath. Let's talk." Mark's eyes filled with tears he didn't want to show. "You don't get it. You walk away from everything and it never touches you. People like me drown and people like you just keep breathing." "Mark," Edward said quietly. "That's not true." Mark stared at him, and for a second, his face softened, but only for a second. Down below, Tommy covered his mouth with both hands. He could barely breathe. He didn't understand everything, but he knew this was bad. He wanted to call out, to shout for someone, but his voice wouldn't come. Edward's voice stayed calm. "Let's end this, Mark. Go home." Mark stood still, trembling, torn between the man he had been and the one he had become. The sound of the river filled the space between them again, steady, uncaring, eternal. Then slowly, Mark turned away once more. He pressed a hand to his face, exhaling shakily. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Edward's eyes softened. "It's all right. Just go." Mark nodded weakly, then walked toward his car again. This time, he didn't stop. When his car finally started and drove away, the bridge fell silent. Edward stood there for a long time, letting the cold air settle around him. He took out his watch again, staring at it before tucking it back into his pocket. Down below, Tommy finally climbed out from under the bridge. His heart was still racing, his fingers numb from the cold. He looked around, making sure no one could see him, and then began walking home along the river path. He didn't know it yet, but the image of those two men and their voices, their faces, that long night on the bridge, it would stay with him forever. The river flowed quietly beside him, carrying away the echoes of words he didn't fully understand, but somehow knew were important. And above it all, the bridge stood still, holding its secrets in the dark, waiting for morning. Morning came quietly. The sun rose over the small town, painting the sky in pale orange and soft gold. The river shimmered in the light, calm and endless as always. From the bridge, you would never have guessed what had happened there the night before, or what was still to come. A fisherman found the old man's body just after sunrise. He had gone out early, like he did every weekend, and spotted something floating near the reeds. At first, he thought it was driftwood, but when he moved closer, his heart froze. By mid-morning, the bridge was filled with flashing lights. Police cars lined the road and yellow tape fluttered in the wind. Officers moved back and forth, taking pictures and speaking in low, serious voices. A small crowd had gathered at the far end, whispering among themselves. Word spread fast. Everyone in town knew Edward Hale, the rich old man who had built half the houses on Main Street, the one who gave money to the library and the church. People spoke his name with a mix of respect and curiosity. And now they said he was gone, fallen into the river overnight. The police tried to keep things quiet, but news like that didn't stay hidden for long. Tommy heard it from his mother that morning while she was on the phone. She gasped and covered her mouth, her voice trembling. "Edward Hale," she whispered. "They found him in the river." Tommy froze in the hallway, holding his backpack. The words hit him like a cold wave. He didn't need to ask which river. He already knew. His mother hung up and turned toward him. "Tommy, you're up early," she said softly, trying to sound normal. "You should get ready for school." He nodded but didn't move. His stomach felt heavy. His mind replayed everything from the night before, and the men's voices, the sound of footsteps, the river's whisper. "Mom," he said after a moment. "Did they say what happened?" She shook her head. "They think he fell. Poor man, he was so old. Maybe he slipped." Tommy didn't answer. He knew it wasn't that simple. He had seen things, not everything, but enough to know it wasn't an accident. But how could he tell anyone? What if they didn't believe him? What if they thought he was making it up like the stories he told in class? He said nothing, just grabbed his backpack and walked out the door. At school, he couldn't focus. The words on the board blurred. The teacher's voice faded in and out. All he could see was that night, the bridge, the two shadows, the sound of the man's voice saying, "I'm sorry." During lunch, his friend tried to talk to him, but Tommy just sat quietly staring at his food. When the bell rang, he went outside and sat under a tree by himself. He thought about the watch, the shiny gold one the old man had held. He remembered seeing it glint under the light, and then after it all, seeing it lying near the side of the bridge. He had picked it up before running home, not really knowing why. Now it was in his backpack, wrapped in a piece of paper towel. He hadn't told anyone. He just kept it there, like a secret that grew heavier every minute. After school, he walked home slower than usual. The police were still near the bridge, talking to people and looking around. Tommy stopped far enough away that they wouldn't see him. He watched as they marked spots on the ground, took photos, and spoke into radios. He saw one of the officers, a tall man with kind eyes, talking to another. The officer was saying something about possible foul play. The words made Tommy's heart race. He wanted to go over, to tell them everything. But when he took a small step forward, he stopped. What if they asked how he knew? What if they got mad at him for not saying something sooner? He turned and walked away, keeping his head down. That night he couldn't sleep. The house was quiet except for the sound of the clock ticking in the hallway. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about the old man's face and the other man's trembling voice. He got up, opened his backpack, and took out the watch. The gold surface caught the dim light from his window. It was cold in his hand, heavier than it looked. He turned it over and saw small letters engraved on the back. E.H. He whispered the name to himself. Edward Hale. Tommy's eyes filled with tears he didn't understand. He wasn't sure why he felt so sad. Maybe it was because he had seen something no one else had. Maybe it was because the old man had looked kind even when things went wrong. He wanted to tell someone, anyone. But every time he imagined it, fear stopped him. The next day, the story was on the news. The headline read, "Local millionaire found dead in river. Police investigate." Reporters stood by the bridge, microphones in hand, talking about Edward's long career, his donations, his legacy. Some said it was an accident. Others whispered it wasn't. Tommy watched from the couch as his mother folded laundry. She sighed. "Such a shame," she said. "He didn't deserve that." Tommy looked down at his hands. "Do you think someone hurt him?" he asked. His mother frowned. "I don't know, sweetheart. The police will find out." He nodded, but the words didn't comfort him. Later that afternoon, he walked by the bridge again. Most of the police were gone, but the yellow tape still fluttered in the wind. The water below looked calm, almost too calm. He stood there for a long time, staring down at it, thinking about how something so peaceful could hide something so sad. He was about to leave when a voice called out behind him. "Hey, kid." Tommy turned. It was the same tall officer he had seen the day before. The man gave him a small smile. "You shouldn't be this close," he said gently. "We're still looking around." Tommy nodded. "I was just walking home." The officer looked at him carefully. "You live nearby?" "Yes, sir," Tommy said. The man nodded. "You come around here often?" Tommy hesitated. "Sometimes. I like the river." The officer smiled faintly. "It's a nice spot, peaceful." Then he paused and looked at the boy again. "Tell me, did you happen to see anyone here the night it happened?" Tommy froze. His heart thudded in his chest. "No," he said quickly. "I went home early." The officer studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right. Well, if you remember anything at all, you come find me, okay? Tommy nodded again. Okay. The officer smiled and walked back toward his car. But as Tommy turned away, guilt washed over him. He wanted to shout, "Wait." He wanted to tell the truth. But the words wouldn't come. That night he dreamed of the bridge again. The voices, the river, the gold watch shining in the dark. When he woke, he was shaking. The next morning, his mother handed him the newspaper. "They're saying it might have been a robbery," she said. Someone took his watch. Tommy's stomach dropped. He stared at the paper, his hands trembling. The word watch jumped out at him like it was glowing. He went to his room and shut the door. He pulled the watch from its hiding place and stared at it. He wanted to give it back, but how could he explain where he'd found it? After school that day, he went back to the bridge. The police were gone now. The place was quiet again. He walked slowly to the middle, looking down at the water. The wind moved softly against his face. He reached into his pocket and held up the watch. It glimmered faintly in the fading sunlight. He thought about the old man, his calm voice, his patience, the way he had tried to reason with the other man. He thought about how scared he had looked. Then he thought about the other man and the sadness in his eyes, the shaking in his hands. Tommy didn't hate him. He didn't even know if he could. He just felt sad for both of them. He turned the watch over again, reading the initials one last time. Then instead of throwing it away, he put it back in his pocket. Maybe he wasn't ready to let go of it yet. Maybe it was the only proof that what he saw was real. As he started walking home, he didn't notice the car parked a little down the road, the same car that had been there that night. Inside sat Mark, hands gripping the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the bridge. His face was pale, his jaw tight. He hadn't slept much since that night. The guilt followed him everywhere, into his dreams, his mornings, his thoughts. He had told himself it was an accident, that he hadn't meant for things to go so wrong, but deep down he knew better. And now, as he saw the small boy walking away from the bridge, something inside him stirred, a strange sense of recognition, as if fate had tied them together without either of them knowing. He didn't know the boy's name or what he had seen, but something about the way the child looked back at the bridge made Mark uneasy. He started the car and drove off slowly, the sound of his tires fading into the distance. Tommy kept walking, unaware that the man from that night had been watching. The river flowed beside him, calm and quiet, as if keeping one more secret. And above it the bridge stood tall, holding memories of what it had witnessed, waiting for the truth to finally surface. The days that followed were heavy for everyone in town. Edward Hale's funeral was held at the small church near the river, and almost the entire community came to pay their respects. The pews were full, the air smelled faintly of old wood and flowers, and the sound of quiet crying mixed with the church bells outside. Tommy sat near the back with his mother. He didn't really know Edward personally, but he felt like he did. Ever since that night, the old man's face had been carved into his memory. The voice, the way he had tried to reason, and the way everything had gone wrong, it all stayed with him. He kept the gold watch hidden in his backpack, wrapped carefully in a piece of cloth. It was his secret, one that grew heavier every day. As the preacher spoke about Edward's kindness, Tommy's eyes wandered across the room. He noticed people wiping their eyes, whispering to each other. But one person stood out, Mark. He was there, dressed in a dark suit, standing near the corner, his face pale and distant. He wasn't crying, but he looked broken in a way that words couldn't describe. His hands trembled as he gripped the back of a pew. Tommy felt his chest tighten. He hadn't seen Mark since that night. For a second, he wanted to run out of the church, but then their eyes met, just for a heartbeat. Mark looked away first. When the service ended, Tommy followed his mother outside. She stopped to speak to some neighbors, but Tommy drifted toward the edge of the crowd. He saw Mark standing alone near the fence, looking out toward the bridge in the distance. His lips were moving slightly, as if whispering something to himself. Tommy hesitated, then turned away. That night he sat on his bed, holding the watch again. He turned it over and traced the letters with his thumb. He wanted to tell the truth. The guilt of keeping it inside was starting to feel too big. He remembered the officer, the one who had told him to come forward if he remembered anything. Maybe it was time. The next morning, Tommy woke early. He put the watch in his pocket and walked to the police station. His legs felt like they were made of stone. The station was quiet, the smell of coffee filling the air. He stood near the counter until a woman asked gently, "Can I help you, honey?" Tommy nodded. "I need to talk to someone. About the man who died by the river." The woman blinked, surprised. "You mean Mr. Hale?" He nodded again. Within minutes, the same tall officer came out from the back. His face softened when he saw Tommy. "Hey there," he said kindly. "You came to see me?" Tommy took a deep breath and nodded. I remembered something." They went into a small room. It had a round table, 2 chairs, and a faint humming sound from the ceiling fan. Tommy sat down, his small hands shaking slightly. The officer smiled gently. "Take your time," he said. "Whatever you remember, just tell me." Tommy pulled the watch out of his pocket and placed it on the table. "I found this," he said quietly. "By the bridge." The officer frowned, leaning forward. "That's Mr. Hale's watch," he said softly. "Where did you say you found it?" Tommy looked down. "I was under the bridge that night," he said. His voice trembled, but he kept going. "I heard them arguing. Then I saw one of them fall into the water. The other man ran away." The officer sat very still. He didn't interrupt. He just listened. "I didn't know what to do," Tommy went on. "I was scared. I thought maybe nobody would believe me. But I saw it. I saw everything." When he finished, the officer nodded slowly. "You did the right thing, Tommy," he said quietly. "I know that must have been scary, but what you just told me helps us a lot." They asked him a few more questions, then thanked him for his courage. When Tommy left the station, he felt lighter, but also nervous. He didn't know what would happen next. 2 days later, the town buzzed again. Police cars surrounded Mark's house. Neighbors peeked from windows as officers led him out in handcuffs. Tommy saw it on the news that evening. His mother gasped when the story aired. "They arrested him," she said softly. "That man, they think he did it." Tommy sat quietly beside her, staring at the screen. Mark looked pale and lost. Not angry, not wild, just broken. The reporter said the police had found evidence of a struggle on the bridge and that new information had come from a young witness. Tommy's mother turned toward him. "A young witness," she said. "Can you imagine? Whoever that was, they must have been very brave." Tommy looked down, hiding the small smile that tugged at the corner of his mouth. Weeks passed. The case went to trial. The courtroom was small and crowded. Reporters filled the benches, their cameras flashing. Tommy had to go too to tell the court what he saw. He was nervous, but the officer stood beside him, giving a small reassuring nod. When they asked him to tell the truth, he took a deep breath and said everything. About being under the bridge, hearing voices, seeing the splash, and finding the watch. His voice shook a few times, but he didn't stop. Mark sat at the table across the room, his head bowed. He didn't look angry. He just looked tired. When Tommy finished speaking, their eyes met for a moment. Mark's eyes were red, full of regret. Later that day, when Mark finally spoke, he said softly, "I didn't mean for it to happen. I just wanted to scare him. I lost everything. My job, my home, my family. I blamed him, but I didn't want to kill him." His voice broke. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of the courtroom clock. The judge listened, the lawyers argued, and by the end of the week, the verdict was announced. Mark was found guilty of manslaughter. He was taken away quietly without a word. When the trial was over, Tommy and his mother walked out of the courthouse. The tall officer caught up with them. "You did something really brave, Tommy," he said, smiling. "Not everyone your age could have done that." Tommy nodded shyly. "I just told the truth." The officer smiled. "That's what real courage is." That night, Tommy walked to the bridge one last time. The sky was calm and the river below shimmered in the moonlight. He stood in the same spot where everything had happened, feeling the cool wind brush his face. He took a small white flower from his pocket, one he had picked from his backyard, and leaned over the railing. "Goodbye, Mr. Hale," he whispered, dropping it into the water. The flower floated gently downstream, carried away by the slow current. He stood there for a while, thinking about everything that had happened, about Edward Hale, about Mark, about the choices people make when they're hurt or scared. He didn't hate Mark, even after everything. He felt sorry for him, sorry for the pain that had twisted him up inside until it broke him. Tommy looked up at the stars. For the first time in weeks, his chest felt light. The truth was out. The old man had peace now, and maybe in a strange way Mark would find some too. When he got home, his mother was waiting by the window. She smiled softly when she saw him. "You okay?" she asked. Tommy nodded. "Yeah, I think I am." She walked over and hugged him. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. He smiled into her shoulder. It felt good to hear that. As he went to bed, he looked out the window toward the river. The moonlight shimmered on the water, the bridge standing tall and silent. It wasn't just a bridge anymore. It was a memory, of fear, of courage, of truth. Months later, the town began to heal. People started talking about Edward's legacy again, the school he helped build, the families he had supported. The story of his death slowly turned into one of remembrance and lessons. As for Tommy, he grew quieter but wiser. He didn't talk much about that night, but sometimes he would walk by the river and just listen. The sound of the water calmed him, reminding him that life moved on, always forward, always flowing. One evening, the tall officer met him there. He had come to check in. "You still visit here a lot, huh?" he asked with a smile. Tommy nodded. "It's peaceful now." The officer leaned on the railing beside him. "You know," he said, "when people tell stories about bravery, they usually talk about grown-ups. But I've been on this job 20 years, and I've never met anyone braver than you." Tommy blushed a little. "I was just there," he said. "I didn't do much," the officer smiled. "You told the truth when it mattered most. That's everything." Tommy looked out at the water, thinking about that. The sun was setting, painting the sky in gold and pink. The world felt big again, full of possibility. As the officer left, Tommy stayed for a few minutes longer. He closed his eyes and let the wind brush against his face. Then he whispered quietly, "Thank you." Though he wasn't sure if he meant it for Edward, for the officer, or for life itself. Maybe for all three. When he finally turned to go, he looked back at the bridge one last time. The evening light made it glow softly, like a promise kept. And somewhere deep in his heart, Tommy knew that even though he was just a boy, what he had done would stay with him forever. The courage it took to speak, the kindness he still held for those who made mistakes, those were the things that made him who he was. The bridge stood tall behind him as he walked home, its reflection steady in the quiet river below. The past had happened there, yes, but now it belonged to something larger, something that had turned pain into truth and fear into strength. As he reached the corner of his street, the night settled softly around him. He looked up once more at the stars and smiled. The story had ended, but the lesson, the power of truth, compassion, and courage, would always remain.